This is Afghanistan, a very mountainous country in Central Asia. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union liked to know who their neighbours were and what ideas they followed. So the Soviets, having Afghanistan as a neighbour, wanted it to have a communist government that would be friendly towards them. President of Afghanistan at the time was called Mohammad Daoud Khan, but he didn't like the idea of being close to the Soviets. So in April 1978, the Sour Revolution removed him from power and he was killed. A communist regime was put in place, and the Soviets were happy. But the Afghan people were not happy. Many Afghans were divided by ethnicity and by clan, and were more loyal to these local structures than to the government. They were very traditional Muslims, and so an atheist regime that tried to control all aspects of life just wasn't going to work. In March 1979, an uprising broke out in the city of Herat. The communist regime struggled to keep order as Islamists, people who wanted their country to be run by Islamic law, were rising up to oppose the new regime. These fundamentalists didn't want communism. They wanted their local traditions and what they saw as a pure Islamic way of life. It became so chaotic that in late 1979, the communist regime sent a message to Moscow asking for help. At first, the Soviet leaders were divided on what to do next, but they realized that if they lost a neighboring country to Islamists, other Muslim countries in the Soviet Union could fall as well. Iran had already been taken over by Islamists early in January, a country right beside Afghanistan and also bordering the Soviet Union. So on Christmas Eve 1979, the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan. What followed was 9 years of grueling guerrilla warfare. The Soviets had no problem taking control of major roads and cities at first, but mountains were everywhere in Afghanistan, and wherever there were mountains, there were mujahideen. Mujahideen means those involved in jihad, holy struggle. They were local Afghan tribesmen who knew the terrain and had nothing but faith and old rifles to keep them going. The phrase, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend," was always a rule of thumb for the Americans. So they decided to support the Mujahideen with weapons and funds to help them wear down the Soviet army. One of the most effective weapons that tilted the war in the Mujahideen's favour was a Stinger missile launcher, which could take down Soviet helicopters. There was also another faction involved in the conflict. The Soviet-Afghan war opened a path for Muslim volunteers from across Asia and Africa to join the jihad, but it also attracted more extreme personalities, people who didn't believe the jihad should stop with the Soviets. These were figures like Abdullah Azzam, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and Osama bin Laden. They set up a network of foreign volunteers flowing into Afghanistan, supported with American, Saudi, and Pakistani money. This was the beginning of a very violent era, not just for Afghanistan, but for the whole world. By 1988, the Soviets were exhausted. Communism across Eastern Europe was already on its deathbed, and the Soviet economy was failing. The Soviet army couldn't defeat the US, Saudi, and Pakistani-backed Mujahideen, and they called it quits. Just 3 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. Now that the Soviet-Afghan war was over, who would rule Afghanistan? The Mujahideen groups couldn't get along in the vacuum left by the Soviet withdrawal, and it turned into civil war. They were still using American weapons and money, along with support from Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. The conflict also left many refugees, and especially young boys in camps along the Afghan-Pakistan border. To support these refugees, the intelligence services of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia set up religious schools called madrasas. But the Saudi brand of Islam was quite unique and very radical, Wahhabism. These boys were being raised with extreme views. The stronger Mujahideen factions, with their American weapons, started recruiting these young boys as fighters. These students were known as Taliban, and they all lived happily ever after.